I'm a slave.
Did the apostolic fathers know the apostles? Straight answer, no. No, they did not. The apostolical fathers had no evidence whatsoever that they had met any of the apostles. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Brothers and sisters, welcome back to my YouTube. Now, today I'm going to be doing something slightly different because I'm feeling a little bit under the weather, but you have to power through with work. I've decided to make some stock video material and at the same time dictate to a voice recorder, which should give us some idea. So who do I mean when I say the apostolical fathers? Well, we're talking about Clements of Rome, Ignatius of Antioch, Polycarp of Samaria, Pallas of Hierephagus, and Quadria of Athens. None of these men have any evidence that they met the elusive John the Elder. And as you can probably guess, this very much stems into much of my history degree in Chalcedonic Christianity. So I felt that this recording was necessary in and upon the reality that we need to grasp the truth. In essence, whenever Christians tell you that they have an unbroken chain of Christianity stretching back from the apostolic fathers all the way into the apostles themselves, all the way towards the New Testament and onwards, and even up to the 12th or 13th century, depending on who you're claiming, is absolute garbage. There is no evidence, no proof, no circumstantial evidence towards anything. In fact, these lists are more or less like propaganda. So I'm going to start with Polycarp. Did Polycarp meet John the Apostle? Polycarp is one of the more infamous or famous members of the Apostolic Fathers, in and upon the fact that he's the one that's mentioned the most about meeting Isa, peace be upon him's cousin. Polycarp was a Christian bishop in what is now modern-day Turkey, around about the 2nd century Common Era. He was born around 69 Common Era and died around 155 Common Era. We have one letter and some quotations from him in other authors, and a ridiculous hagiographic legend was he studied under John the Disciple and met others who had seen Jesus. But there's no evidence that's true, and it's highly unlikely. We have no text from Polycarp himself making this claim, nor do any of his letters we have addressed to Polycarp mention it. There is also no evidence that any of the apostles who actually alive when Polycarp was even a schoolboy, which would have been around the late 70s Common Era, and as early as at the earliest, when the apostles would have been in their 60s or 80s if any of them were physically alive. Now, as I've mentioned many times before, I'm personally quite sceptical when it comes towards being alive of most of the apostles after 80 Common Era. Even the venerability of John the Elder, who was still travelling and whose death by Roman legionaries we have no knowledge of. So the speculation with John the Elder is we don't know his history. That's the problem. After 56 Common Era, where Octavius Pontifarius saw or claimed to have sawn the cousin to Isa, or the rebel of Nazareth, inside the lower levette but could not have made an arrest, was the difficulty involving much of what he was doing. But the appeal of the legend of Polycarp has made John and other apostles is that since Polycarp was reputed to be a hardcore historicist, pushing the narrative that Jesus really visited earth as a divine being and the disciples really did sit at his feet, learning from God himself, one might try to argue that this supports this historical Jesus. This is not a very strong argument when you're making this, as you imagine, as either the apostles or Polycarp may have been party to the transition in dogma from a relativity to the early church figures, but still it's worth looking into. So let's have an example of some of the sources, shall we? Our sources for the claim are not renowned for their reliability, but are also infamous apologists, and polyclaimist mainstream scholars tend to not trust this. Now, most polyclaimists are not genuinely people because they're very atheistic in their nature. So take upon what polyclaimists say with a pinch of salt, but they do give a good grounding historical reasoning on why we shouldn't necessarily do this, and I will explain as I go through this. Irenaeus writes in 180 Common Era, Tetrius writing in the 200 AD, and Eusebius, who wrote, Eusebius writing in the early 300s. And it is sometimes claimed that these guys say that Polycarp himself had said he had met an actual disciple of Isa, peace be upon him. Yes, that's multiple layers of hearsay, but that's not even true. So we're going to now take apart Irenaeus. Probably the person who made the most claims, because Irenaeus is, whether we like it or not, a student of Polycarp. So this is where the early church fathers gain a great deal of their claim. Their clemency comes from Irenaeus. That Irenaeus was the student of Polycarp and Polycarp was the student of John. So Irenaeus wrote two passages about Polycarp, the first coming in the context of Irenaeus attempting to claim there had been an uninterrupted succession of bishops at Rome from the apostolates to his own day, specifically to combat the contrary claims of heresies. But scholars know such succession lists, which only come later and are never sourced, are precisely the kind of thing propagandists invite for the very purpose of legitimising their claim and pedigree towards their claims towards the bishoprics. This is unfortunately a false narrative. There is absolutely no evidence toward this. So apparently no one really trusts them anymore, though it's worth noting that Irenaeus admits the apostles had known hidden mysteries. Now I get the indication from things like the 12 Imams when I hear things like Irenaeus writing about the hidden mysteries, and I see the crossovers Islamically, which they were in the habit of imparting on the perfected apart and privileged few of Christians who were of the most pious and most dedicated in their belief. Now this again reminds me of what we commonly hear or see amongst the 12 Imams. Irenaeus then inexplicitly diverges to discuss Polycarp for no reason other than he just happens to be another bishop somewhere else where Irenaeus was keen to justify as having similar calamity towards his pedigree statements. Now this is an extract specifically from Irenaeus that I'm going to read for you from Irenaeus' Against the Heresies 334, for those who want to know where I'm getting it from. Polycarp was also not only instructed by apostles and conversed with many of who had seen Christ, but it was also by apostles in Asia, appointed bishop of the church of Samaria, who I also saw in my early youth, for he tarried it a very long time, and when a very old man, gloriously and most nobly suffered martyrdom, departed this life, having always taught the things which he had learned from the apostles, and which the church had handed down, and which alone are true. To those things all the Asaretic churches testify, as do also those men who have succeeded Polycarp down to the present time, a man who was of much greater weight and a more steadfast witness of truth than Valentus and Marcion and the rest of the heretics. He it was who, come to Rome in the time of the ancients, caused many to turn away from the aforesaid heresy of the church, and proclaim that he had received this one and sole truth from the apostles, that namely which is handed down by the church. There were also those who heard from him that John, the disciple of the Lord, going to bathe at Ephesus and perceived Cerinthus within rush out of the bathhouse without bathing, exclaiming, "Let us fly! Let even the bathhouse fall down, because Cerinthus, the enemy of truth, is within." This is also a very powerful episode of Polycarp writing to the Philippines, from which those who choose to do so and unax it about their salvation can learn the character of his faith and the preaching of the truth. And as I said previously, Irenaeus Against Heresy 334. So this is a very clear indication that Irenaeus himself points as a game of Chinese whispers. I heard, therefore I saw, thereby granted, from the Aseretical church. But it never directly indicates that Polycarp himself had stated these conversations. You see, the man who has alleged, and my fingers are doing brackets, that he was trained by Polycarp have no indication to doing so. And you get more and more of this the more you read into IRENAEUS' works, in how incredibly cagily he describes it. He never saw Polycarp say that. He merely found it from the disciples. He just declared that Polycarp was instructed by an apostle and conversed with many who had seen Christ. But when IRENAEUS gets to mention having met Polycarp himself and heard him preach, neither claim is the attribute to him. IRENAEUS thus never actually said Polycarp said he was instructed by an apostle. And this is a very critical point I must hold against Christian apologists who refuse to acknowledge that IRENAEUS never directly said these words himself. And these points have to be held forward, because many apologists would have, and young apologists would have it believe that there is an unbroken line, and there isn't. The evidence that stands before much of what IRENAEUS placed is in many ways supersendus, innuendo, and from the Asoretic Church, and at no point did Polycarp himself say so. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you for coming to my spoken word. This isn't what I usually do, but occasionally I go back to it whenever I'm feeling crap and I actually have to do a verbal podcast, relatively speaking. I hope to make the scenical view enjoyable, and it was a pleasure having you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
I am a slave.